The gavel came down like a gunshot. It cracked through the silence of Federal Courtroom 7 and echoed off the mahogany walls and the high plaster ceiling, and every person in that packed gallery flinched. Every person except one. Captain Darius Cole sat in the front row with his hands folded in his lap, his back perfectly straight, his face unreadable. He did not flinch. He did not exhale with relief. He simply watched. At the defense table, a man named Wade Harmon stood frozen, gripping the edge of the wood in front of him with both hands, his knuckles bone white, his face the color of old chalk. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. The certainty that had carried him through 11 years of doing whatever he wanted on the roads of Crestwood, Pennsylvania, and never once facing a real consequence for any of it, that certainty was gone too. In its place was something naked and small, the expression of a man who has finally and completely run out of road. What you are about to hear is the story of one night on a rain-damp stretch of Route 9 in Crestwood, Pennsylvania. A single traffic stop. A routine power play that Wade Harmon had run dozens of times before, a 3-minute exercise in deliberate intimidation that had always ended the same way with a shaken driver, a fabricated report entry, and Harmon walking back to his cruiser, feeling like the rules of the world applied differently to him than to everyone else. Except this time the man behind the wheel was not who Harmon thought he was. And by the time the truth came out, it would not just end one career. It would bring down an entire machine that had been grinding quietly in the dark for over a decade, processing people through its gears and spitting them out, and calling what it did law enforcement. This is the story of how a predator walked into a trap he built himself, and how justice, quiet and patient and absolutely uncompromising, was finally delivered to a community that had been waiting for it far too long. Darius Cole was 54 years old the night it happened. He was not a young man anymore, and he felt it on evenings like this one after 16 straight hours at his desk working through files that documented the worst of what one person can do to another from behind the protection of a badge. He was driving home in his personal vehicle, a charcoal Audi A8, wearing a plain gray zip-up and dark slacks, looking like any other tired man on the road at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in March. Nobody looking at him would have guessed what he was. And that, as it turned out, was exactly the point. Wade Harmon was parked in the turnout on Route 9, his pale eyes scanning the dark for something to stop his right hand tapping a slow rhythm on the steering wheel. He had no idea that the most consequential night of his life was already in motion. He had no idea that the man in the charcoal Audi, about to pass his position, had spent the last 3 weeks reading files that contained his name. This is how it started. And this is how it ended. Wade Harmon liked to think of himself as a cop's cop. He had been on the Crestwood Police Department for 11 years. And in that time he had built a reputation that his colleagues described, at least in the locker room and at the bar, as the kind of hard-nosed, no-nonsense enforcement that kept a city orderly. They called him the Sheriff. He accepted the name without irony. In Harmon's mind, the roads of Crestwood had a certain order to them, a geography of belonging, and part of his job was to maintain that geography. He had never put that belief into those exact words, not even to himself. He had not needed to. It operated beneath conscious thought as comfortable and automatic as breathing. Crestwood, Pennsylvania, was a mid-sized city pressed up against itself, old-money neighborhoods sharing boundary lines with working-class blocks, in a geography that had never entirely resolved its contradictions. The police department that served it ranked 11th in the entire state for racial profiling complaints filed per officer. In 6 years, the union leadership had buried 9 formal investigations. 9 times, someone had put together enough documentation to file a complaint, and 9 times the complaint had been reviewed by the same people whose interest it was to make the complaint go away, and 9 times it had gone away. Harmon worked the same 4-mile stretch of Route 9 near Crestwood's wealthiest, most uniformly white suburb. He knew that corridor the way a person knows a room they have lived in for years. Every shadow and every angle of light, every point where visibility dropped and where a stop could happen with minimal witness exposure. He had an unwritten rule that he had never articulated aloud and would have denied if directly asked. A black driver in a luxury vehicle on that road after dark was probable cause, not in any legal sense. Not in any sense that could survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. But Harmon had run that calculation dozens of times over 11 years, and no consequence had ever followed, and unchallenged habits become convictions. Sitting beside him in the passenger seat that night was Officer Danny Pruitt, 26 years old, 4 months out of the academy, assigned to Harmon as his field training officer. Pruitt had grown up in Crestwood. He had believed in the idea of the job, the genuine usefulness of it, the way good policing could be something a person was proud to do. 4 months with Harmon had been complicating that belief in ways he did not yet know how to process. He had witnessed 3 stops in 4 months that he knew were not legitimate. He had told himself each time that he was new that he did not yet understand how the job worked in practice, that Harmon had 11 years of experience and must be seeing things that Pruitt was not seeing. The lie was getting harder to sustain. They were in the turnout at 10:53 when Harmon straightened in his seat. A charcoal Audi A8 was moving south in the right lane. Smooth and even headlights clean, holding a perfect 58 miles per hour in a 60-mile-an-hour zone. The registration tags were current under the passing streetlights. The vehicle was maintaining its lane without deviation. There was no observable infraction. There was no legal basis for a stop. Pruitt said Brad, "He is doing the speed limit. Tags are fine." Harmon said, "That is exactly how they drive when they are hiding something." He reached for the switch. The cruiser erupted in red and blue, pulsing through the light mist that clung to the road and throwing color across the pine trees on the shoulder. The siren gave one sharp yelp, and inside the Audi, a man named Darius Cole looked in his rearview mirror and felt something that was not fear and was not surprise. It was recognition. He had been expecting this. Not tonight specifically, but something like tonight on this road from this turnout. He had noted it on a map 3 days ago. He put on his turn signal. He moved smoothly to the shoulder. He brought the car to a stop beneath a flickering street lamp, put it in park, rolled down his window all the way, and placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He waited. He watched in the mirror as Harmon got out of the cruiser without bothering with the rain jacket despite the mist, and he watched Harmon's right hand settle on the butt of his holstered weapon before he had taken 3 steps. Cole noted that too. He noted everything. Darius Cole had been a state police officer since he was 25 years old. He had started on patrol in a department much like this one, in a city much like this one, and he had spent 3 decades rising through a system that was not always enthusiastic about promoting men who looked like him doing it anyway, through a combination of precision and persistence, and a specific kind of patience that is harder to maintain than anger, but more durable. He had risen to major crimes commander. He had worked cases that required years and the kind of meticulousness that never made the evening news. He had learned to read institutions the way a physician reads diagnostic images, looking not at the obvious damage, but at the density and structure of the tissue around the damage, the places where something had calcified instead of healed. When the state attorney general received a federal oversight complaint about Crestwood PD, a complaint that was specific enough and documented enough that it could not be quietly resolved, they needed someone to go in. Someone with the rank to command the room. Someone with the credibility to survive what the union would do. Someone who understood what they were walking into. They chose Cole. He had been in Crestwood for 3 weeks when the night on Route 9 happened. He drove his personal car on audit nights deliberately. He had learned over the years that a man in a patrol vehicle moves through a different world than a man who appears to be nothing in particular. Anonymity was a form of information. It showed you things you could not see from behind a badge. He had pulled the stop data for the Route 9 corridor 4 days earlier and run the numbers. He had circled Wade Harmon's badge number on a patrol pattern map that was sitting in a folder in his desk at the precinct. The numbers around that badge number told a story so clear that it barely required interpretation. When the lights came on behind him on Route 9, Cole was not surprised. He was not afraid. He was precisely, methodically focused. Harmon came to the window slowly, deliberately shining the flashlight directly into the driver's eyes before he reached the door. It was part of the choreography, the way you reminded a person that you were in control of the light and the dark. Cole blinked against it, but did not turn his face away. "Good evening, officer," he said. His voice was deep and resonant and entirely calm. "Could you tell me the reason for the stop?" Harmon leaned down and put his face close to the window. "I asked the questions," he said. "License and registration, now." "My wallet is in my left jacket pocket," Cole said. "My registration is in the glove compartment. Before I reach for either, I need to inform you that I am carrying a licensed firearm secured in a lockbox bolted under the driver's seat. The firearm is secured. I am making the disclosure required by law." The next 2 seconds happened very fast. Harmon yanked his service weapon from its holster. He screamed the word "gun" with enough force that it cut through the night air and the mist and reached the cruiser where Pruitt heard it, and had his hand near his own weapon before he had consciously decided to move it. Harmon ordered Cole to open the door from the outside using his left hand. He told him to move slow. He told him to do it now. In the passenger seat, Pruitt said, "Brad, he just told you about it. He disclosed it. That is what you are supposed to do." Harmon told him to be quiet. "I am complying," Cole said clearly and calmly. Left hand on the door. He reached his left arm out through the open window, found the exterior handle and pushed the door open slowly. He stepped out into the mist, keeping his hands open and visible, narrating each movement aloud for the record he knew was being made and stored in a place that no one in Crestwood could reach. He stood beside the car with his hands at his sides, hands on the roof. Harmon ordered, stepping back and holstering his weapon. Cole turned and placed both palms flat on the wet roof of the Audi. Harmon stepped forward and grabbed Cole's wrists and twisted them behind his back with more force than the situation required, the force of someone who was sending a message rather than securing a suspect. The handcuffs went on in one practiced motion, ratcheted down until the metal pressed into bone. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," Officer Cole said quietly. "I would strongly recommend that you look in the center console of this vehicle before you say another word." Harmon laughed. It was short and dismissive. He shoved Cole toward the cruiser. Harmon pointed at Pruitt across the roof of the Audi. "Search the vehicle," he said. "Find the lockbox. See what else is in there." Pruitt looked at him. "Brad, we do not have the probable cause for a search." He complied with everything. He disclosed the firearm. The lockbox is legal. He did not commit an infraction. "Are you going to make me write this up twice?" Harmon said. Pruitt looked at the handcuffed man at the back of the cruiser. Cole was watching him. Not with anger, not with desperation, with a steadiness that Pruitt had not encountered in someone in handcuffs before. It was the look of a man who knew what was happening and had decided that his role in it was simply to be present and let the truth do its work. Pruitt got his flashlight and went to the driver's side of the Audi. The interior was exactly what a person who had told the truth would have. Immaculate, no smell of anything that did not belong, no contraband visible. The center console held a phone charger, a small notepad, a package of mints. He reached under the tray. His fingers found something rectangular wrapped in leather the color of dark burgundy. He pulled it out and turned it in the beam of his flashlight and found the edge of the fold and opened it. The gold shield caught the light immediately. It was not a thin, decorative gold. It was heavy and deeply engraved, the kind of weight that tells you without requiring any other explanation that it is real. Beside the shield was an identification card bearing 2 seals, the seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, above the seal of the Crestwood Police Department. Below the seals in clean block letters, Captain Darius Cole, Director of Internal Affairs, Crestwood Police Department, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Pruitt stood in the drizzle beside the open door of the Audi and did not move. The sound of the rain on the car's metal roof filled the silence. Then he said Harmon's name, just once, quietly. The way you say someone's name when you need to tell them that the situation is fundamentally different from what they believe it to be. Harmon came around the car and grabbed the credential wallet from Pruitt's hand and shone his flashlight directly at it. He read it the way a man reads something he desperately needs to find a flaw in. There was no flaw. The shield was solid and precisely engraved. The ID had a holographic watermark that moved correctly in the beam of the light. There was a chip embedded in the backing that Harmon recognized as the kind used for secure state-building access, the kind that did not appear on counterfeit credentials because you could not replicate it without access to state manufacturing systems. The air left Harmon in stages. Pruitt watched it happen. He watched the color drain. He watched the confidence collapse behind his partner's eyes. He watched the moment when the full size of what he had done assembled itself in Harmon's mind with complete and terrible clarity. And then he watched Harmon make the decision that would cost him everything. "Fake," Harmon said. His voice had gone half an octave higher than normal. "This is a quality fake. Impersonating a sworn officer is a felony. Book him on impersonation. Cuff him tighter," Brad Pruitt said. "Look at the watermark. That is a state hologram. That is not reproducible." "Get back in the car," Harmon said. He jammed the credential wallet into his jacket pocket, grabbed Cole by the arm, and marched him toward the cruiser. Cole went without resistance. He was already composing the incident report in his mind. The drive to the 6th precinct took 11 minutes. Harmon had radioed in the stop before they reached the on-ramp, his voice controlled and flat. He described erratic lane changes that had not occurred. He described a suspect who was uncooperative and aggressive. He described suspected impersonation of a law enforcement officer and possible narcotics involvement. He built the story with the practiced efficiency of a man who had built false narratives before, who knew which details were specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be difficult to disprove. Pruitt stared out the passenger window and said nothing. From behind the plexiglass divider, Cole's voice came into the silence of the car. "Officer Pruitt." Pruitt tilted his head slightly without fully turning around. "By the time we reach the precinct, you will have one decision to make," Cole said. His voice was even and unhurried. It contained no threat and no urgency, just the statement of a fact offered to someone who still had time to act on it. "Your career depends on making the right one." Pruitt said nothing. He looked out the window at the lights of Crestwood sliding past in the wet March dark, and he thought about what he had seen on that road, and he thought about what the right choice actually was, and he thought about how much harder it was going to be to make it than not to make it. Harmon drove and talked about the union, about how these things got handled, about badge grifters and quality fakes, and how any reasonable person in his position would have made the same call. The words were not addressed to Pruitt. They were not an argument being made to anyone in particular. They were the sound of a man talking over his own fear, trying to drown it out with the noise of his own certainty. In the back seat, Cole sat straight and quiet and let his mind work. He thought about the dashcam footage uploading in real time to a state server that no one in Crestwood could access. He thought about the 22 names in the files in his desk at the precinct. He thought about what it meant that he was sitting in handcuffs in the back of a police cruiser, and he thought about what it was going to mean in 4 months. He breathed slowly. He let his mind do its work. The 6th precinct booking area smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, and the particular staleness of recycled air that never quite gets replaced. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed at a frequency you stopped noticing after 20 minutes, and then noticed again when the room went quiet. The walls were painted cinder block layered over enough times that the surface had a slightly textured quality, the accumulated history of a building that was maintained but never renovated. Desk Sergeant Lou Malone was behind the high booking counter when the doors came open, reading glasses on the end of his nose, working through a log sheet. He was 51 years old, 22 years on the job. He had developed over those years the specific skill of reading a situation from across a room before anyone in it had said a word to him, the way a person who has seen enough of something learns to trust what they see before they trust what they are told. He looked up when Harmon came through with the handcuffed man. He read Harmon first. Controlled movement over something agitated performed confidence over something that was moving with genuine fear underneath it. He read the handcuffed man second. The handcuffed man walked with the posture of someone who was simply going from one place to another, entirely unconcerned with the circumstances of how he was getting there. His bearing was the bearing of a person whose mind was occupied and moving at its own pace, undisturbed by the theater around him. Malone set his pen down. Harmon announced to the room in the loud, carrying voice of a man presenting something he was proud of. He listed the charges: impersonation, concealed weapon, resisting. He said the man had been found with a counterfeit badge of high quality and had been combative when confronted. He dropped the burgundy credential wallet on the booking counter. The sound of it hitting the wood was sharp in the quiet of the room. Nobody said anything. Malone looked at the wallet. He picked it up slowly. He opened it the way you open something that you already sense is going to change your understanding of the room. He read the shield. He read the card. He read the name. He read the title. He turned the credential over and found the authentication chip on the back of the shield. His face did not change. His hand moved to the desk phone. He dialed a 3-digit internal extension without looking up. Harmon was mid-sentence building his narrative when Malone looked at him over the top of his reading glasses. "Wade, stop talking. Right now." The room went quiet, in the way rooms only go quiet when something fundamental about them has just shifted. Frank Delaney made it from his house to the precinct in 5 minutes. He came through the booking area door in his overcoat. His face, the face of a man who understood from the first sentence of the phone call that the night was not going to end in any way that resembled how he had imagined it when he went to bed. He had survived 19 years in a department that was not always interested in integrity by being the kind of person who understood which direction the institutional wind was blowing before other people could feel it on their skin. He was not corrupt in the way Harmon was corrupt. He was corrupt in the quieter way of someone who had told himself for years that looking away was a form of pragmatism, and who had lived with that story long enough to have stopped examining it. He walked into the booking area, and he looked at the credential wallet on the counter, and he looked at the handcuffed man standing in the center of the room, and he looked at Wade Harmon, and his expression settled into something careful and very still. Cole spoke before Delaney said anything. "Good evening, Deputy Chief," he said. His voice was quiet and composed. "My name is Captain Darius Cole. I am the Director of Internal Affairs for this department. I was stopped without cause on Route 9 approximately 40 minutes ago. I was handcuffed without probable cause by Officer Harmon, who was clearly informed of my identity and chose to proceed regardless. I would like to have these handcuffs removed before I make a phone call." Delaney looked at Harmon. "Harmon," said Chief, "the credential is a quality fake. Nobody carries their IA credentials in a personal vehicle at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It does not add up." Cole said Internal Affairs commanders conducting covert audit reviews of their own departments do. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Delaney picked up the credential wallet and turned it over in his hands. He found the authentication chip on the back of the shield. He held the ID card up under the fluorescent light and read every line of it twice. He set the wallet down on the counter and looked at Harmon. "Remove the handcuffs," he said. Chief Harmon started. "Remove them now, Wade." Harmon's hands were shaking as he reached for the key. The cuffs clicked open. Cole brought his hands forward and rubbed his wrists slowly, his face showing nothing of what that felt like. He took his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. He spoke for 45 seconds to the State Attorney General's duty officer. He gave his identification code, the incident classification code, Harmon's badge number. He used the word unlawful. He used the word federal. He hung up. He looked at Pruitt, who was standing near the door, looking like a young man who has just watched an accident happen in slow motion and is still processing the fact that it is over. "Officer Pruitt," Cole said. "Interview room 1. Write down everything that happened tonight. Every detail. Do not omit anything. I will be there shortly." Then he turned to Harmon. "As of this moment, you are suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. Your service weapon and your badge go to Sergeant Malone. You do not leave this building tonight." Harmon looked at the room the way he had always looked at rooms when he needed something from them. He was looking for the solidarity, the shared understanding, the invisible agreement that said there was a side and he was on it and the men around him were on it with him. The room would not give it to him. Malone was writing in his log. The officer at the far desk had found his paperwork very interesting. The officer near the coffee machine had turned to face the far wall. Even the room had chosen. Harmon unbuckled his gun belt with shaking hands and laid it on the counter. He unpinned his badge and set it beside the belt. For 11 years, that badge had been the most important thing he owned. It had been his authority, his identity, his proof that the world was arranged in a way that favored him. Standing under fluorescent lights in the booking area of his own precinct without it, he was just a man in trouble. And the room around him had already moved forward without him. Cole said one final thing to him before he walked away. He said it quietly enough that only Harmon heard it. "I have been watching that stretch of Route 9 for 3 weeks, Cole said. "I have been watching you. You chose the wrong car tonight. But the truth is that you were always going to choose the wrong car eventually. That is how this was always going to end." Then he turned and walked toward the interview room, and the door closed behind him. Danny Pruitt was sitting in the interview room 1 with a blank legal pad in front of him and a pen in his right hand looking at the blank page when Cole came in and sat across from him. Cole did not bring a recorder. He did not bring another officer. He simply sat down and folded his hands on the table and looked at Pruitt for a moment with an expression that was honest without being harsh. "Let me tell you exactly where you are," he said. Pruitt looked at him. "You have been present for 4 stops in 4 months that you knew were not legally justified. You said nothing during any of them. Tonight you were present for a false arrest and a federal civil rights violation, and you did not stop it." Cole paused for a moment. "That makes you an accessory to all of it if you say nothing now. I am not here to threaten you. I am here to tell you the truth, which is that there is one path out of this room that preserves your career, and that path runs directly through everything you write on that pad tonight. Not what you think protects you. The truth." Pruitt was quiet. "He is going to say I was coerced," Pruitt said. "He probably will," Cole said. "And the evidence will answer that. But I need the statement to be complete, and I need it to be the truth." Pruitt looked at the blank page. "Am I going to destroy the whole department with this?" Cole considered the question. "I am going to remove what is broken," he said. "What is working gets to stay." Pruitt put the pen to paper. He wrote for 90 minutes without stopping except twice. 14 pages. Every detail of that night, from the first moment Harmon fixed on the Audi through the moment the cuffs were removed. Every detail of the 3 previous stops he had witnessed. The specific language Harmon had used. The fabricated justifications. The way Harmon had coached him afterward on what to say if anyone asked. He wrote the plain, factual truth of what he had seen. When the last page was done, Cole closed the folder. "Thank you, Officer Pruitt," he said. "You made the right choice." He said it simply because it was accurate and nothing more was needed. What Harmon did not know sitting in the deputy chief's office that night was the thing Cole had not yet told anyone in the precinct. He had not told them about the investigation running beneath the investigation. When the state appointed Cole to the Crestwood Internal Affairs Command, the mandate that came with the appointment had a second component that did not appear in any public document. The federal oversight complaint that had triggered everything was detailed enough about how the department protected its problem officers that the AG's office believed something organized was at work, not just individual failures, but an institutional mechanism of insulation and cover-up. They wanted to know exactly what that mechanism was, not just to remove one officer, but to remove the entire structure that allowed officers like him to operate. Cole had done 2 things in his first week that Crestwood PD knew nothing about. The first was a department-wide dashcam firmware update. The update was described to the department as a routine video compression patch. What it actually installed was an automatic encrypted upload protocol that activated the moment any siren in the fleet was engaged. Every second of footage from that trigger point was transmitted in real time to a state server. The local hard drive on the vehicle was completely irrelevant. The footage was in a location that no one in Crestwood, no officer, no union official, no former department captain, no one could access or alter. The second thing was a full 11-year analysis of stop data for the Route 9 corridor. 214 stops over 11 years. 81% of the drivers stopped were Black or Latino. 38 stops in the corridor near the affluent suburb had ended in vehicle impoundments through a single towing company. Miller Brothers Towing, owned by Gerald Miller, who was married to Wade Harmon's older sister. Financial records traced $52,000 from Miller Brothers through a series of transfers to a consulting account registered to an entity that resolved when state investigators subpoenaed the registration records to an address connected directly to Harmon. 9 formal complaints had been filed against Harmon through the internal complaint system over 11 years. All 9 had been dismissed by the same supervisory chain. The dismissal records used language so similar across all 9 files that they appeared to have been written from a single template. Cole had that template. He had the names of everyone who had signed the dismissals. He had the union president's internal emails showing exactly how the decision to clear Harmon had been made at least 3 of those 9 times. He had all of it. He had been waiting for one more piece, a documented incident with a reliable witness and footage that could not be destroyed. He had not arranged what happened on Route 9. He had simply driven home on the road where the data said Harmon hunted in the kind of car the data said Harmon could not leave alone, and he had waited to see whether Harmon would do what Harmon always did. Harmon had not disappointed him. Within 24 hours of the stop, Cole's investigative team opened a victim tip line through the state AG's office. The line was staffed for 72 hours. 22 people called. 22 people who had been stopped on that road or in the surrounding corridors and had been carrying what happened to them in silence because no one who was supposed to listen had been willing to listen. Cole read every statement personally. He read them at his desk in the precinct at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he did not rush through a single one. Robert Elias was the principal of Crestwood North High School, a man in his late 50s who had spent his professional life teaching kids in the city's most under-resourced neighborhoods. 2 years earlier, Harmon had pulled him over on Route 9 at 9:30 in the evening. Harmon had said he smelled marijuana. There was no marijuana. Elias had been handcuffed on the roadside in front of 3 passing vehicles held in a cell for 36 hours before charges were quietly dropped. His car had been impounded through Miller Brothers. The fees came to $940. The school board had convened an emergency meeting during those 36 hours. He had kept his job. He had not told anyone the full story for months because he had not believed it would make any difference. Darnell Price was a paramedic in his mid-30s, working night shifts at Crestwood General. Harmon had stopped him on a Saturday morning coming off a 12-hour shift on a fabricated equipment violation, a tail light that the dash cam would later show was functioning perfectly. Price's car went to Miller Brothers. He could not retrieve it for 4 days because the fees exceeded his available credit. He borrowed his neighbor's car to get to work. He had never filed an official complaint because 3 people he knew had been through something similar and none of them had been believed. Cole called each of the 22 people. He said the same thing to each one. Your case is part of a federal record now. No one is burying it again. He said it plainly and without performance because these people had heard enough that turned out not to be true. The only thing he could offer that meant something was the truth itself, offered as simply as possible. 4 months passed. For Wade Harmon, they were 4 months of slow disintegration. The union hired Greg Whitmore, a defense attorney who had handled department cases before and who came in with standard strategies that had worked in the past. He filed motions and constructed arguments, and presented alternative interpretations with professional confidence. He argued the credential case could reasonably have appeared counterfeit in nighttime conditions. He filed a motion to suppress the dashcam footage, claiming the squad car's hard drive had been damaged by water infiltration the night of the stop. The local hard drive, his forensic consultant confirmed, was unreadable. Every strategy encountered the same obstacle. The evidence. Carl Bassett. The union president, who had personally signed 3 of the 9 complaint dismissals, had received a visit from federal investigators 30 days after the stop. He had emerged from it quieter than anyone who knew him had ever seen him, and had not been to see Harmon since. The federal indictment arrived 63 days after the stop. 3 counts: deprivation of civil rights under color of law, aggravated assault, obstruction of justice. Harmon sat in his kitchen and read the document and did not speak for a long time. Federal Courtroom 7 in the Western District of Pennsylvania was a room built to make the people inside it feel the full weight of what happened there. High ceilings, dark wood, brass fixtures that had been polished into a quality of permanence. The gallery, filled on the first morning with reporters and civil rights advocates and community members and off-duty officers, some there out of loyalty that had not yet caught up with the facts, and many more there to witness something they had stopped believing Crestwood was capable of producing. Harmon sat at the defense table in a suit that did not fit him the way his uniform had. He was thinner. The 11 years of certainty had left him in a way that was visible like scaffolding removed from a structure that turned out to need more support than anyone had admitted. In the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table, Captain Darius Cole sat in his full Class A dress uniform. Brass buttons precise on the jacket, commendation ribbons in their rows, gold captain's shield pinned exactly to his left breast. He sat with his hands folded and his back straight, and from the moment he walked down the center aisle and took his seat, Harmon had not been able to look at him directly. Lead prosecutor Sandra Reeves stood at the podium and addressed the jury with the precision of someone who knew her material completely. She said this was not a case about a difficult moment on a dark highway. She said it was a case about a pattern that had been running for over a decade about a man who had decided that certain roads belonged to him and certain drivers were subject to rules that everyone else was not subject to, and who had made the irreversible mistake of running that routine on the one person in Crestwood most uniquely qualified to hold him fully accountable for it. Defense attorney Greg Whitmore delivered his opening statement with the practiced confidence of a man who had made weaker cases sound reasonable before. He talked about the difficulty of nighttime patrol, the weight of split-second decisions, the stress of a demanding job. He called Harmon dedicated. He used the word isolated twice. 3 jurors in the back row were already watching him with flat, measuring eyes. The prosecution called Danny Pruitt first. A murmur moved through the gallery when his name was announced. Everyone in that room understood what the blue wall of silence was. It was the foundational compact, the unspoken agreement that had protected officers like Harmon for decades. Watching Pruitt walk through the wooden gate and take the oath was the first clear crack in the wall that had surrounded Harmon for 11 years. Harmon gripped the edge of the table. Reeves walked Pruitt through the night of March 4th with methodical precision. Did the vehicle cross the yellow line at any point before the stop was initiated? No, ma'am. The vehicle was maintaining its lane perfectly. It was traveling at 58 miles per hour in a 60-mile-an-hour zone. Did Officer Harmon state a reason for the stop before activating the lights? No, ma'am. When the driver disclosed that he was carrying a legally secured firearm, how did Officer Harmon respond? He drew his service weapon. Was the driver being cooperative at that point? Yes, ma'am. His hands were on the wheel. He had answered every question. He disclosed the firearm exactly as the law requires. He was entirely cooperative. Whitmore came to cross-examination with aggressive energy. He suggested Pruitt had been coerced by internal affairs, that his testimony had been shaped under implicit threat that he was sitting in that chair because investigators had made it clear that his silence would cost him his career. Pruitt listened to all of it without changing his expression. When Whitmore finished, Pruitt turned and looked at Wade Harmon across the well of the courtroom for the first time. Harmon met his eyes for 1 second and looked away. Pruitt turned back to the jury. "Nobody threatened me," he said. "I am sitting in this chair because I watched a man be pulled from his own car in handcuffs for driving while Black and I did not say anything while it happened. I will not make that mistake again." The gallery did not applaud. It simply went very still, the kind of stillness that is heavier than noise. Greg Whitmore had filed his pretrial motion to suppress the dashcam footage on the grounds of water infiltration damage. His forensic consultant had confirmed the local hard drive was unreadable. Reeves called Martha Okafor, the state IT director, to the stand. Okafor explained the firmware update in plain, precise language. She described the automatic encrypted upload protocol. She explained that the moment any siren activated, the footage was transmitted in real time to a state server. She explained that the local hard drive had never been relevant to the integrity of the stored footage. She said the footage from Squad Car 4A for the night of March 4th was complete and had never been compromised. The courtroom screens came on. For 6 minutes and 17 seconds, the jury watched the footage in high definition. They watched the charcoal Audi holding its lane, holding its speed, doing absolutely nothing that would justify a stop. They heard the interior microphone of the cruiser with complete clarity. "Look at this guy. Out here past midnight in a $90,000 car. Let me see what he is hiding." They watched the lights go on over a vehicle that had done nothing wrong. They watched Harmon approach with his hand already on his weapon. They watched the gun come out in response to a calm, cooperative, legally required disclosure. They watched all of it in high definition without pause for 6 minutes. When the screen went dark, 2 jurors in the back row were visibly shaken. Whitmore did not cross-examine the IT director. He sat down without saying anything. Reeves called her final witness on the 3rd day. Cole walked to the stand in his dress uniform and took the oath in the same resonant, measured voice he had used in a rainstorm 4 months earlier. Reeves took him through the night of March 4th methodically. He described every detail of it with the precision of a man who did not need to embellish accurate information. Reeves asked him the question the gallery had been waiting to hear. "Captain Cole, why did you not immediately identify yourself to Officer Harmon when he first approached your vehicle?" Cole looked at the jury. "If I had shown that shield the moment he walked up to my window," he said, "Officer Harmon would have let me drive away with an apology and a 'have a good night, Captain.' And the very next night he would have done exactly what he did to me to a man who did not have a gold badge to protect him. I needed to see what Crestwood looked like when it believed no one important was watching. That was what I was sent here to find out." Whitmore attempted cross-examination. He tried to frame Cole as calculating, as agenda-driven, as someone who had engineered a confrontation for his own purposes. Cole answered every question with the same, even unmovable precision. His demeanor did not shift. He was not defensive because there was nothing to be defensive about. Whitmore made the mistake that ended his defense. He said in his closing argument to the jury that the incident involving Captain Cole was an isolated occurrence of poor judgment under pressure by an otherwise dedicated officer with 11 years of service. Reeves objected. Judge Patricia Owens looked at Whitmore over her glasses for a long moment. "Counsel," she said, "you have just made a claim about your client's character and prior conduct. The prosecution is now entitled to rebut that claim with the full record." She paused. "I will allow it. Proceed." Reeves introduced the full 11-year statistical audit. 214 stops. 81% minority drivers. The towing records, the financial transfers, the 9 complaint dismissals, the template used to write all 9 of them, the union president's emails. Robert Elias testified. He wore a tweed jacket and spoke with the measured dignity of a man who had been carrying something heavy for 2 years and was finally setting it down in the right place. He described the stop on Route 9. He described the handcuffs on the roadside in front of passing vehicles. He described 36 hours in a cell. He described the school board meeting. He described $940 in impound fees. He described the months of silence. He described what it costs a person to be publicly humiliated for doing nothing wrong. His voice was level and clear throughout. It landed in that courtroom with the weight of 2 years of unexpressed truth. Darnell Price testified after him. He was younger, and the composure was harder for him to sustain. When he said the word home, describing what he had simply been trying to do on the morning, Harmon stopped him. His voice broke once briefly. He steadied himself and finished. The jury leaned forward. 3 jurors were visibly taking notes by the time he stepped down. Harmon's face had passed through several expressions during those testimonies and had arrived at something empty and hollow. The defensiveness was gone. His attorney had stopped the small reassuring gestures, the hand on the arm, the whispered confidence. Carl Bassett in the gallery had his arms crossed and his eyes fixed somewhere above the defense table, and had not looked at Harmon since Pruitt left the stand. Whitmore's closing argument was brief and defeated. He spoke about service and sacrifice and used the phrase "thin blue line" in a way that told you he knew it was not going to land. Sandra Reeves stood before the jury one final time. "You have seen the footage," she said. "You have heard the testimony. You have reviewed 11 years of documentation that does not lie and cannot be explained away." Wade Harmon did not make a mistake on the night of March 4th. He executed a routine he had been running for over a decade, and happened to execute it on the one person in Crestwood best equipped to hold him fully accountable. The badge was never a burden to Wade Harmon. It was a weapon. And on the night of March 4th, he aimed that weapon at the Director of Internal Affairs of his own department. She looked at the jury. 22 people are waiting to be believed, she said. Return a verdict that believes them. She sat down. The jury filed out at 11:22 in the morning. 3 hours and 47 minutes later, the foreperson stood. We, the jury, find the defendant Wade Harmon guilty. Guilty on count 1, deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Guilty on count 2, aggravated assault. Guilty on count 3, obstruction of justice. Harmon gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles went beyond white. In the front row of the gallery, Darius Cole looked at the floor for a single, quiet moment. Not triumph. Not the particular satisfaction of a score being settled. Just the exhale of a man who had made a promise to 22 people and was keeping it. Just a man who had done the work and arrived at the end of it. Then he raised his eyes and looked at the front of the room. Judge Patricia Owens had served on the federal bench for 23 years. She had sentenced cartel enforcers and corrupt politicians and violent offenders of every category. She addressed Wade Harmon at sentencing with the particular weight of someone who had considered what this moment required and had decided it required more than the sentence. In 23 years, she said, I have encountered many forms of abuse of the public trust. But there is a specific and profound category of contempt reserved for a man who took an oath to protect and instead used that oath as cover for predation. You did not serve Crestwood. You did not protect it. You operated a private campaign of targeting against its residents for 11 years, and you were protected from the consequences of that campaign by a structure designed to ensure that protection. That structure no longer exists. You are standing here as its final piece. She signed the sentencing document with a sharp, deliberate flourish. 168 months in federal custody. 14 years, no parole. Complete forfeiture of his municipal pension. Permanent decertification from any law enforcement position anywhere in the United States. The pension funds to be distributed to the 22 documented victims, beginning immediately. Harmon's legs failed him. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was the quiet failure of a man whose legs had simply declined to hold him anymore. He grabbed for the edge of the table and missed, and the nearest federal marshal caught him by the bicep with a grip that was firm and impersonal, the same grip and the same pressure that Harmon had once used on a man standing handcuffed in the rain on the shoulder of Route 9. The symmetry was exact. No one mentioned it. Harmon was turned. He was shackled. He was walked toward the side door at the front of the courtroom, his feet dragging slightly against the floor, the shackles marking each step. Cole watched him reach the door. He watched it close. He sat in the silence that followed and let it settle around him, and he did not look away until it was complete. While the jury had been deliberating those 3 hours and 47 minutes, the federal warrants had been served. FBI agents had arrived at the Crestwood Police Union headquarters and at the private residence of the former precinct captain who had signed 6 of the 9 complaint dismissals. The former captain had been found in the process of shredding documents. Carl Bassett, the union president, was indicted the same day on obstruction and witness tampering charges. The machine that had kept Harmon operational for 11 years was being dismantled in the same hours that the verdict dismantled him. Miller Brothers Towing was seized by state financial investigators. Gerald Miller faced state fraud charges and civil suits from each of the 38 drivers whose vehicles had been impounded without cause. Restitution proceedings began within 30 days of sentencing. Frank Delaney, who had removed the handcuffs on the night of the stop and had cooperated fully from that moment forward, was retained in his position. Cole recommended him in a written memo as the official best position to lead the department's reform implementation. It was a careful recommendation. Delaney had survived a corrupt environment by asking only the questions whose answers he could live with, which was his limitation, and also the source of his usefulness now that the environment had changed. Danny Pruitt was transferred to a community liaison unit. He would work with the neighborhoods along Route 9 and the surrounding corridors, the communities that had lived alongside what Harmon had been doing for years. Cole wrote his evaluation himself. It said that Pruitt had made a serious error over 4 months that he had corrected under significant personal pressure, and that the correction was the more important fact. It said Pruitt had done the right thing when it mattered. Cole left it at that. If you want to stay connected to stories like this one, stories about accountability, about people who refuse to stay quiet until justice arrives, then subscribe to our channel. There are more of these stories to tell. The community that had watched Crestwood police cruisers with a learned mixture of resignation and dread did not change overnight. Justice does not change things overnight. It changes the conditions, and then other things grow in those conditions slowly and imperfectly, and with setbacks over a long stretch of time. Cole spent the year following the trial inside the department doing the work that does not make headlines. New stop documentation protocols, an independent civilian oversight board that reported to the state, not to the union or the department it was overseeing. A direct community complaint line staffed by state personnel that could not be routed back through the same people being complained about. The work was not visible in the way the courtroom had been visible. It was the hard, slow, invisible labor of building something in a place where the previous structure had been specifically designed to prevent certain things from ever being built. He did it because it was the job he had taken, and because he understood that the verdict was not the end of anything. It was the condition that made the real work possible. Wade Harmon began his sentence at a federal correctional facility in western Pennsylvania. Protective custody. 22 hours a day in a cell 6 feet wide and 9 feet long. The badge that had been the center of his identity for 11 years was in an evidence box in a state storage facility. What remained was a man who had built everything about himself around an authority that had been permanently removed, living in a space smaller than a parking spot for the next 14 years. Robert Elias and Darnell Price received their first restitution payments 43 days after sentencing. Elias deposited his check and then called his attorney and told him he was going to donate the money to a legal defense fund for unrepresented traffic stop victims in Crestwood. The attorney said that was a meaningful thing to do. Elias said he was not doing it to be meaningful. He was doing it because someone needed to make sure the next person who called an attorney from a jail cell in this city had one available to answer. He said it quietly and without fanfare, the way a man speaks when he has found a way to close a chapter he did not write and did not deserve to be a part of. Captain Darius Cole drove home on Route 9 on a Thursday evening in late September, 6 months after the trial. Same road, same hour. The air had the quality of early Pennsylvania fall, cool and clear, carrying the smell of something turning. There was no squad car in the turnout on the far shoulder. No lights came on behind him. He drove the full length of the 4-mile corridor at 58 miles per hour, with both hands on the wheel, and he came out the other side and kept driving, and the road behind him was just a road. He had gone back the way a person returns to a place where something important happened, not to relive it, but to confirm that it had been changed. The road confirmed it. He drove on, and the city of Crestwood settled into the fall evening behind him, and somewhere in the quiet neighborhoods along that corridor, 22 people were living the rest of their lives in a city that had finally been made to answer for what it had allowed to happen to them. It was not enough. It is never entirely enough. But it was what justice looked like when it arrived. It looked like a road with no lights behind you. It looked like a man driving home. The evening that everything changed had started the same way most of Darius Cole's evenings had started in the 3 weeks since he arrived in Crestwood. He had been at his desk before anyone else arrived, and he was still at it when most of the building had gone dark. The files he was working through were not pleasant reading. They were the accumulated paperwork of years of decisions made by people who had learned to write what was needed to make a problem go away, rather than to document what had actually happened. He had seen this kind of paperwork before in other cities, other departments, other investigations. After 29 years, he recognized it on sight, the careful vagueness, the repeated phrases, the way justifications were worded to survive a review without actually describing the event. It had a specific texture, official language deployed in the service of concealment, and he had become fluent in reading what it was hiding. By 10 that night, he had reviewed 42 use-of-force incident reports and cross-referenced 31 of them against citizen complaint records and found the kind of gaps that told you everything about who was being protected and from what. He shut the files and put them in his briefcase and turned off the desk lamp. He drove his personal car because he always drove his personal car on the nights he worked late in a department he was investigating. He had explained this choice to the Attorney General's office when they first discussed his approach. He had said that a man in a marked official vehicle is a man who changes the environment he is studying simply by being in it. A man in a personal vehicle is just a man on a road. The road tells you things that the vehicle would conceal. He drove through Crestwood on his way to Route 9, and he looked at the city as he passed through it. He saw the way the neighborhood character changed as you moved between the older residential blocks and the newer commercial development near the highway interchange. He saw the way the street lighting got sparser as you moved away from the wealthier addresses. He saw the kind of details that a person notices when they are looking at a city as an environment, and not just as a route between 2 points. He had grown up in a city like this one. Not this one, but one with the same architecture of inequality, the same visible lines between who the city was built to serve and who it was built to contain. He had become a police officer in part because he believed that a police force could choose which direction it faced toward the people who held power and needed their comfort maintained, or toward the people who had less and needed something more than maintenance. He had spent 29 years trying to be a person who faced the right direction. He was not naive about how often that effort failed. He was not naive about what he was going to find in Crestwood, but he had agreed to come because the 22 files that he did not yet know existed had been accumulating in this city for over a decade, and the people whose names were in those files deserved someone who came to Crestwood with his eyes open and his intentions clear. He turned on to Route 9 at 10:47 in the evening. He noted the squad car in the turnout at 10:49, a Crestwood PD unit sitting in the darkness with its lights off positioned to have a clean line of sight down the approaching lane. He had noted that exact position on a patrol pattern map 4 days earlier. He drove past it at the speed limit with both hands on the wheel, and he did not slow down, and he did not speed up, and he waited. The lights came on at 10:53. He was not surprised. He was not afraid. He had known for several days that something like this was likely to happen on this road, and he had known when it happened that it would need to be exactly what it was: a clear, documented, unambiguous civil rights violation conducted on a person who could survive it and who had the standing and the evidence to make sure it answered for itself. He signaled. He moved to the shoulder. He stopped the car. He rolled down the window all the way. He placed his hands where they could be seen. He breathed slowly, and he let the moment come to him. Wade Harmon had been having a slow night before the Audi appeared. The kind of slow night that made him restless in a way that was not entirely about boredom. He had a particular need that the job fed a need to establish the terms of encounters to be the person in any situation who held the power and set the tempo. When the road was empty and nothing presented itself, that need went unsatisfied and he grew irritable in the low simmering way of someone who is being kept from something they feel entitled to. He had pulled over 3 vehicles in the past 2 weeks on this stretch of Route 9. 2 of those stops had resulted in impounds through Miller Brothers. He had placed the calls himself using a specific tone with his brother-in-law that carried the mutual understanding of an arrangement that had been working without any need for explicit discussion for years. The 3rd stop had ended without an impound because the driver had been elderly and white and had started crying almost immediately, which changed the calculation in ways that were not about mercy and were entirely about exposure. He did not think about the arrangement with his brother-in-law as corruption. He thought of it as a benefit that had emerged naturally from the job, the way certain people in certain positions found ways to supplement what the official pay scale provided. He did not think about the 9 complaint files that existed somewhere in the department's records cleared and closed and filed away. He did not think about the 22 people who had not filed complaints, who had paid their impound fees and gone home and tried to close a door on what had happened to them. He did not think about any of that. He thought about the charcoal Audi passing his turnout at 58 miles per hour in a 60-mile zone, smooth and even, doing nothing wrong. He thought about the silhouette he could see through the tinted glass. He thought about how easy this was going to be. He reached for the switch. He did not know reaching for that switch that the firmware update applied to his dash cam 2 weeks earlier had been quietly transforming his vehicle into a recording device that reported to a server he had no knowledge of. He did not know that the moment his siren activated, everything happening inside and around that vehicle was being transmitted to a location he could not reach and a record he could not alter. He did not know anything about what was coming. He was a man who had done the same thing dozens of times and had never once been made to answer for it, and that absence of consequence had become in his mind something very close to permission. The booking area of the 6th Precinct had a quality at 11 in the evening that was distinct from what it was at other hours. The day shift's energy was long gone. The midnight rush had not yet arrived. It was the quietest hour in a building that was never truly quiet, and in that particular quiet the sound of the doors opening and the sound of Harmon's voice announcing his charges carried to every corner of the room with unusual clarity. Lou Malone had been a desk sergeant for 11 of his 22 years on the force. He had sat behind that counter and processed 10,000 pieces of business from the routine to the extraordinary, and he had developed in those 11 years what he thought of privately as an ear for the room. He could hear in the quality of a person's voice as they spoke to him across that counter what they were not saying. He could hear confidence, and he could hear its performance. He could hear the difference between a man who had done something right and was reporting it, and a man who was telling a story about something and hoping it would survive contact with the facts. He heard Harmon's voice, and he knew immediately before he had read a single word of the credential wallet that something was wrong with the story being told. He looked at the handcuffed man and he heard something else. Not a person performing composure. Not a person suppressing panic. A person who was genuinely fundamentally undisturbed by his present circumstances, not because he was unaware of them, but because he understood them in a way that Harmon clearly did not. Malone had seen that quality of composure in 3 other people in 22 years. 2 of them were federal agents. The third was a judge who had come in to report a purse snatching and had sat in the booking area for 40 minutes discussing the incident with the same calm authority he brought to his courtroom. He opened the credential wallet and he read what was in it, and he reached for the phone. He did not make a show of it. He did not make a speech. He dialed 3 digits and waited for the line to connect, and when it did, he said 4 sentences and hung up. Then he looked at Harmon over the top of his reading glasses and told him to stop talking. It was the most useful thing he did all evening, and it required almost no effort at all. Danny Pruitt did not sleep that night. He sat in interview room 1 for 90 minutes writing a statement that documented the things he had seen and not reported. When he was done, he went to his car in the precinct parking lot and sat in it for 20 minutes without turning on the engine. Then he drove home. He went inside and he made coffee he did not drink, and he sat at his kitchen table until 5 in the morning, and he thought about what he had said and what it was going to cost him, and whether it had been the right thing. By 5 in the morning, he had arrived at an answer that was not entirely comfortable, but was, he believed, accurate. The answer was yes, not because of what Cole had told him about his career, not because of what the evidence showed, because of the look on the face of the man who had been sitting in the back seat of that cruiser with his wrists in handcuffs, who had not been afraid, who had been patiently and methodically collecting everything that was happening to him as evidence for what would come after. He had been waiting for someone to make the right choice. Pruitt had finally, 4 months late, and under considerable pressure, made it. He went to work the following morning, and he filed the supplementary statement that Cole had asked for 3 additional pages covering 3 previous stops that he had witnessed and not reported. He wrote it in plain language describing what he had seen, not what he had been told to say he had seen. He signed it. He submitted it. Then he went to the break room and made himself a cup of coffee and sat down and thought about what kind of officer he was going to be going forward. He did not have a complete answer to that yet, but he understood that this was the first morning of working toward one. The days between the indictment and the trial moved in the particular way that time moves when a large consequence is approaching. For the 22 people who had called the tip line those days held something they had not had in a long time, which was the sense that what had happened to them was going to be acknowledged publicly in a way that could not be dismissed or filed away. Some of them had told their families the full story for the first time after Cole's call. Some of them had not choosing to wait until there was a verdict before they said the word believed aloud. Robert Elias had told his wife the complete truth about the 36 hours in a cell within 24 hours of speaking with Cole. He had told her because the investigation made the truth feel solid in a way it had not felt before, something that could be stated without the accompanying fear that the person hearing it would doubt him or be unable to help him. His wife had sat with him for a long time after he finished. She had not said anything for a while. Then she had said that she wished he had told her the moment he came home. He had said that he had not known how to make her believe it when he did not have the language to say why it had happened. She had said she would have believed him. He had said he knew that now. Darnell Price had told his mother. His mother had told him that she had known something had happened on that Saturday morning, but had respected his decision not to talk about it. She had said that sometimes you wait for a person to be ready and you make sure the door is open. He had thought about that for a long time after the conversation. Cole read about the trial from the inside of it, doing the preparation work that witnesses do, reviewing his own notes, working with Reeves's team to ensure the testimony was complete and accurate. He was not nervous about taking the stand. He had testified in more proceedings than he could remember, and he understood the stand as a place where accuracy and composure produced better outcomes than eloquence. He was focused on the outcome, not on Harmon. Harmon was the symptom. The machine that had protected Harmon for 11 years was the disease. The trial was necessary and the verdict was necessary, but the work that would mean something lasting was the work Cole was already planning for the months after the verdict, the structural changes that would make the next Harmon less likely and the next 22 people less inevitable. He thought about those changes during the breaks in the trial preparation. He thought about the committee structures and the reporting lines and the complaint processes and the oversight mechanisms. He thought about the specific language that would need to go into the new protocols to ensure they were not simply cosmetic. He had done this kind of rebuilding work before. It was the part of the job that did not make the news and was not discussed in the gallery of a federal courtroom. It was also, in his experience, the part that mattered most. The morning of the verdict, the gallery of Federal Courtroom 7 was as full as it had been on the first day of the trial. The community members who had come to watch were mostly quiet. They had learned over years and decades that wanting something to be true was not the same as it being true, and they held the question of the verdict carefully, not letting themselves all the way into the feeling of it until they heard the words. When the foreperson stood, the room went very still. When the words came guilty on all 3 counts, the stillness held for a long moment. And then something happened that was not quite applause and was not quite silence. It was more like a collective breath, the sound a room makes when something has been held for a long time and has finally been set down. In the front row, Darius Cole sat quietly and let the breath move through the room around him. He did not celebrate. He did not feel triumphant. He felt what he always felt when a case ended with the right outcome, which was a specific combination of completion and forward motion. The case had ended. The work had not. He thought about Robert Elias and Darnell Price and the 20 others. He thought about the files in his office and the protocols he had drafted and the conversations he needed to have with Delaney about the first month of implementation. He sat in the front row of Federal Courtroom 7 in Crestwood, Pennsylvania, on the day that Wade Harmon was found guilty on all counts, and he was already thinking about what came next, because that is what the work required. And Darius Cole had always done the work. The state had been watching Crestwood for longer than Cole had been in it. The federal oversight complaint that arrived at the Attorney General's office 14 months before Cole took the Crestwood assignment had been specific in its details in a way that anonymous complaints rarely are. It named specific officers. It named specific stops with dates and locations. It described the internal complaint process with an accuracy that suggested the person who wrote it had been through it personally and had also done research into how it worked for other people. It named the union president. It named the former precinct captain. It was not the complaint of someone who was afraid and venting. It was the complaint of someone who had taken time to build a case and wanted it to go somewhere. The AG's office had investigated quietly for 6 months before deciding they needed someone inside. Cole had read the complaint in its entirety before agreeing to take the assignment. He had read it the way he read everything that came from outside official channels, looking not just for what it said, but for what it revealed about the person who had written it. What he found was a document written by someone who understood both the specific harm and the structural protection of that harm, someone who had seen the machine from close enough to describe its parts. He never found out who had written it. He had tried, through the investigative channels available to him, to trace the complaint back to a specific source. He had been unable to. What he found was that it had been submitted from a public library terminal in a Crestwood neighborhood that sat at the intersection of 2 of the corridors most heavily affected by Harmon's stop pattern. He had thought about that for a while. He had thought about the person who went to a library and spent an afternoon writing a document that described the machine that had been running against them and the people around them, and submitted it without a name attached, not knowing if it would go anywhere, not knowing if anyone would read it and take it seriously, but doing it anyway because the alternative was to continue saying nothing, and the cost of saying nothing had already been paid by too many people. Cole had that person in his mind throughout the investigation. He had that person in his mind when he drove through the neighborhoods along Route 9, and when he read the stop data, and when he sat across from Danny Pruitt in the interview room and asked him to write the truth. He thought about someone sitting in a public library with no guarantee that anything would change, choosing to try anyway. That was the kind of courage that most people never named and never received credit for, the kind that happened in ordinary places in library chairs, and at kitchen tables without an audience and without certainty. It was the kind of courage that had made everything else possible. The trial itself lasted 11 days. 11 days of testimony and evidence and argument in a room that had the particular quality of a place where things are decided that cannot be taken back. Reeves's team presented the case with the methodical clarity of people who had prepared exhaustively and who trusted the evidence to do most of the work. The evidence was substantial. The dash cam footage, Pruitt's testimony, the 11-year statistical audit, Elias's testimony, Price's testimony, the financial records linking Harmon to his brother-in-law's towing company, the 9 complaint files and the template that connected them. Whitmore fought for every inch of ground he could find, and there was very little of it. He challenged the statistical methodology of the stop data analysis. He challenged the chain of custody of the financial records. He attempted to reframe Pruitt's testimony as the product of coercion. He tried to suggest that Cole's decision to withhold his identity constituted a form of entrapment. None of it held. The evidence was too complete and too consistent and too clearly documented in a format that could not be compromised after the fact. The jury watched the footage. They heard the voice on the interior mic of Squad Car 4A, saying what it said in the clear, unambiguous tones of a man who believed he was speaking only to his rookie partner. They heard the gun come out. They saw the gun come out. They saw in high definition what a routine power play looked like when no one was supposed to be watching. They had been watching. They deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes, and they came back with a verdict that contained no ambiguity. Guilty, guilty, guilty. There is a particular sound that a federal courthouse makes after a verdict like this one. It is not the sound of celebration. In the movies, verdicts like this one produce applause and tears and embraces in the gallery the release of everything that was held during the waiting. In reality, what you get more often is a different kind of sound, something quieter and more complex. The sound of a room full of people who have been holding something for a long time and are only beginning to believe they can set it down. Robert Elias sat in the third row of the gallery when the verdict was read. He was wearing the same tweed jacket he had worn to testify. He had his hands folded in his lap, and he sat very still when the words came out, guilty, guilty, guilty. And he continued to sit very still for a moment after the words had settled. Then he took a slow breath, and then he put his face in his hands for approximately 30 seconds, not sobbing, not making any sound, just holding the moment with the privacy of a person who has been waiting for something long enough that its arrival requires a moment of adjustment. Darnell Price sat beside him. He was looking at the front of the room when the verdict came, watching Harmon's reaction, watching the way the man's body absorbed the words. He saw the grip on the table edge. He saw the color leave Harmon's face. He saw the moment when it became real. He watched it without satisfaction and without any particular emotion he could name. He had thought he would feel something specific in this moment, something that resolved the tow fees and the borrowed car and the 4 days and everything that had happened in his mind since. What he felt instead was something more diffuse, a loosening, the particular release of something that has been held for a long time without the holder fully knowing how tightly they were holding it. He breathed. He looked at Elias beside him, face still in his hands. He reached over and put his hand briefly on the older man's shoulder. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Sentencing was 2 weeks after the verdict. Judge Owens took her time. She had reviewed everything, all 11 days of testimony, all the evidence, all the filing and counter-filings, and she had consulted the full federal guidelines, and she had read the victim impact statement submitted by all 22 people who had been identified in the investigation. She had read every statement twice. She sentenced Harmon in a courtroom that was again packed again, quiet again, holding its breath. She spoke for 13 minutes before she delivered the sentence. She spoke about what the oath of a law enforcement officer means and what its violation costs the people who trusted it. She spoke about the specific harm caused not just by individual violations, but by the erosion of institutional trust that occurs when a machine like the one surrounding Harmon is allowed to operate. She spoke about the duty of a court to respond to that kind of harm in a way that is proportionate to what it actually cost. She spoke carefully and precisely. as someone who had thought for 2 weeks about the right things to say. Then she delivered the sentence. 168 months, 14 years, no parole, complete forfeiture of pension, permanent decertification. She said that the pension funds distributed to the 22 documented victims would carry with them a formal acknowledgement from the court that each of those people had been wronged by a person who held public trust and violated it, and that the acknowledgement was as important as the funds. She said that before closing. Then she brought the gavel down. The sound of it filled the room and then faded, and in the silence that followed, Crestwood began slowly, and with justified skepticism, and with a long way still to go to change. 1 year later, Captain Darius Cole attended a community meeting in a church hall in one of the neighborhoods that runs along the Route 9 corridor. The meeting had been organized by a group of residents who had been working with the civilian oversight board that Cole's reform protocols had established. They were presenting their first annual report on stop patterns in the corridor compiled from the new documentation requirements that every officer in Crestwood was now required to follow. Cole sat in the third row of folding chairs and listened. The numbers were not perfect. The work was not done. The community's skepticism of the department was not going to be repaired by one verdict or 1 year of new protocols, or one oversight board report. Trust is not rebuilt in a year. It is rebuilt in a decade of consistent behavior in thousands of small interactions that go the right way when the previous expectation was that they would go the wrong way. Cole knew this. He was not looking for perfection. He was looking for direction, for evidence that the needle was moving in the right direction, for signs that the condition was improving, even if the improvement was modest and imperfect. What he saw in that church hall in the faces of the people who had come out on a Tuesday evening to review a report and ask questions and push back on the answers was exactly that. People who had been here before and had seen things not change. People who had decided, despite that history, to try one more time. That was what accountability looked like when it was working. Not triumph, not resolution. People who kept trying. He sat in the third row of folding chairs in a church hall in Crestwood, Pennsylvania, and he watched them try, and he thought that this was what he had come here to make possible. Not the verdict, not the sentencing, but this ordinary Tuesday evening meeting in a church hall, these people and their questions, and their insistence on answers. He thought it was worth all of it. He drove home on Route 9. The road was just a road. There are moments in every investigation that become the pivot point, the moment from which everything after is either building towards something or falling away from it. For the Crestwood investigation, that moment was not the verdict. It was not even the stop on Route 9, though the stop was what made everything visible. The pivot point was the moment Danny Pruitt opened the burgundy credential wallet and held it under his flashlight and read the name and the title and understood what he was holding. Because in that moment, Pruitt had a genuine choice. He could have set the wallet down. He could have turned back to the car and said nothing. He could have let Harmon write whatever report he was going to write and stayed out of it, and told himself later that it had not been his business, and that he had not had enough information, and that he was new and did not understand how things worked yet. He had already spent 4 months telling himself versions of that story. He could have told it one more time. He chose not to. He said Harmon's name. Just once, just the first name, quietly. That was the pivot. Everything that came after the statement. The testimony. The dismantling of the union's cover-up machinery. The 22 victim accounts entering the federal record. All of it flowed from that single quiet moment on a wet highway shoulder, where a young officer decided that the story he had been telling himself was no longer one he could live in. Cole had thought about that moment many times in the months after the trial. He thought about how close it had come to going the other way. He thought about the different way things would have proceeded if Pruitt had said nothing, if he had climbed back in the car and let Harmon drive, and let Harmon write the report and let the credential wallet disappear into the system the way 9 complaint files had disappeared before it. Cole had known, going into that night, that the dash cam footage would survive no matter what happened. He had known that the documentation of the stop would be established. He had known that the case would move forward regardless. But Pruitt's testimony had changed the shape of what moved forward. It had taken the case from a matter of documentation and made it a matter of witness, someone who had been in the car, who had seen what happened without a screen or a server between him and it, who could stand in front of a jury and say, "I was there, and I saw this, and it was wrong." Witness testimony does something that documentation alone cannot do. It puts a human being in the room with the truth. It makes the truth legible to other human beings in a way that numbers and footage and statistical analyses, however accurate and however important, cannot fully accomplish on their own. Pruitt had done that. Cole had told him at the end of the interview room session that he had made the right choice. He had meant it. He meant more by it than the words themselves contained. He meant that the choice to say the name quietly just once on a wet highway shoulder had been the kind of small act of conscience that the entire weight of an investigation can pivot on. He had not said all of that to Pruitt. Pruitt was 26 years old and had done the right thing under considerable pressure and did not need a speech about it. He simply needed to know that it had been the right choice. Cole had told him that, and then he had given him a job to do, which was perhaps the most useful thing you could offer a person who had just changed the direction of their own life and was not yet sure what that meant. The evening before Harmon's sentencing, Cole sat in his office at the precinct until 9 o'clock. He was not reviewing files. He was writing, not the sentencing memo which Reeves had handled, not the reform protocols which his team had been working on for weeks. He was writing something personal, a letter that he would never send addressed to no one he could name. He was writing to the person who had submitted the federal oversight complaint from a public library terminal in Crestwood 14 months ago. He had never found out who that was. He had tried and he had been unable to. He wrote the letter anyway. He wrote about what the complaint had made possible. He wrote about the 22 people and their names, and their specific situations, the principal and the paramedic and the 20 others. He wrote about the verdict. He wrote about what was going to happen to the department in the months ahead, the new protocols and the oversight board and the changes to the complaint process. He wrote that none of it would have begun without the complaint. He wrote that the person who submitted it had made a decision without knowing whether anyone would read it or act on it or take it seriously, and that the willingness to try without certainty was a form of courage that he wanted to acknowledge even if he could not do so directly. He wrote for about 40 minutes. Then he folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. He sat for a few minutes in the quiet of his office and thought about what it means to do the right thing without knowing the outcome. Then he turned off the desk lamp and picked up his briefcase and drove home. Tomorrow, the judge would bring the gavel down. Tonight, this was enough. And that was enough. Not because the work was done. It was not done. It would not be done for a long time if it was ever the kind of thing that could be called done. But because sometimes the work of accountability is not about arriving at an ending. It is about refusing to stop. It is about the person who sat in a library and wrote a complaint without a signature. It is about the rookie who said a name quietly in the rain. It is about the man who drove home on a Thursday evening on a road that used to mean something else and felt the ordinary weight of a night that held nothing threatening. That is what justice looks like when it comes, not a resolution. A road, and a man on it going home.